also interested in knowing more about your story because I know you were part of the US team that helped with the prosecution in the Rwanda Genocide, including the former president of Rwanda. So how did that come to be? And if you're comfortable, of course, what was that experience like? Because I also know that you worked initially for Facebook for a little bit of time. And I'm very interested to know how that happened. I know you were in the Silicon Valley, but like, how did that connection happen and what was it like working there?
When I was CEO of Lex Machina, the only business book I found useful was not from a fancy business school. It was not, the popular ones. It was a book called Founders at Work. And it was written by, I believe it's Jennifer Livingston. She was the co-founder of Y Combinator. All she did was she interviewed like the second or third employees of these great companies, Facebook, Google, Yahoo. Those anecdotes were 10 times more useful than someone else's theory.
So I'm going to take a lot of steps back, right? Can we start at the absolute bare fundamental of what does AI even mean? Because I think a lot of that fear is coming from not understanding what it means to begin with.
Partners leave, attorneys go from firm to firm. But if the firm can develop its intellectual property, it can develop economies of scale and its system and the hard assets, in addition to being able to offer intellectual property insurance, right? Things like that, which make defense and other things easier. You can also use your data and your patent rights now to borrow money.
So do you have any initial thoughts on what this project could look like for a law firm that's never really delved in building out an AI algorithm before?
That's a great topic. I could probably spend a day going through that.
Just wanted to understand in the current market, right? There are a lot of legal data analysis software. How does Lex Machina still remain relevant in the market?
So I read the newspaper, and when I was a first-year student in college, the Bosnian Genocide was happening. For my junior year, I studied abroad in Ireland. I studied ethnic nationalist, basically terrorist groups inside Northern Ireland, Protestant paramilitary groups. Somehow survived that, I'm not sure how, but through good luck. And then I was hitchhiking through the war zone in Bosnia. And then when I was there, and it was tricky to get inside the Bosnia-Herzegovina at the time, the Rwandan genocide happened that summer when I was there in 1994.
And is it possible for you to sort of break down just how you went about building out what the data set would look like? Like, what does the ideation process look like?
But anyway, so that's the short answer. That was the milieu in which CodeX came about. Then the problem was, what's our first project? And I think if we can criticize ourselves a little bit, I started out as the executive director. I think we waited too long to find the perfect project, and we just should have picked a pretty good one of our top 5 and just gone for it, get it funded. It's still just beginning. I think we're still at the very early stages of what you can do for that. But one of the things I love about it the most, Shreya, is that it's so global. Like CodeX, it's almost bigger outside of Stanford than it is in Stanford, and I love that.
I sort of agree with you because I think as lawyers, it's a notion that's reinforced so often that everything you create is a snowflake, that you sort of fail to see how so much of it is coming from a precedent or is coming from somebody else's work that you could have just, picked up and built on, like added value on top of it and compounded on somebody else's work rather than having to reinvent the wheel every single time. I want to take another point from what you just said, right, which is more about legal prediction using data. And do you see that being used very often in your jurisdiction and across the world?
You asked me what I would do as a law student now. I would do projects. Like I would create something. And that's a radically different approach to pedagogy and learning. But the other thing I found, running a startup, as much as I've felt privileged to have learned from all these places, I learned at about a 10x rate to anything I've ever experienced before educationally.
Joshua. Thank you so
Howdy.
much for thank you so much for coming and agreeing to do this interview with Prolawgue today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me today.
All right. So for everybody who has not had the chance to stumble upon Joshua yet, which I'm sure a lot of people would have by now interested in this field, Joshua is the co-founder of CodeX, which is the Stanford Center working on the intersection of everything technology and law. He's also co-founded Lex Machina, which we're going to talk about more in detail during the course of the interview. He's received his AD from Harvard College and his JD from Chicago Law School. And he's the author of the book titled On Legal AI. He's been working on the intersection of technology and law for like over 2 decades now. And I'm sure there is a lot that we can learn from him today, including some very, very basic fundamental questions like, what does AI even mean? And I am very excited about this conversation. So Joshua, we're just sort of going to jump in. You've done your education from Harvard and your JD from Chicago Law. And you were also the Cornerstone Scholar. Were you always a very, very meritorious student?
Yeah, never. I was never a good student until I would say my third year of law school. I became a good student because I had a lot of friends who were very hardcore A+ students, and they probably helped me along. But I was already always doing things that were a little bit independent and that were sometimes fairly creative. And so I got away with a lot, but I only really became a top-notch student in my last year of law school, like when you really don't need to be. That was the hopefully I'm a good student now. So I try to learn as much as I can every day, and I did tend to do very robust, creative research, and the things that I was really addressing, I took very seriously. So it took me a while, but I got there.
And was law a conscious decision?
Not initially. What led me to law school was really the newspaper. I was reading the newspaper every day. I had been to a bunch of we'll call them nerd camps. I was at Stanford when I was 15 at they called it the Junior Statesman Summer School, and really enjoyed that summer. And I was at a nerd camp for international affairs in the Canadian Rockies when I was later in high school. So I had gotten into human rights and that sort of thing before, and they said, read a newspaper every day, right? That's one of the things they tell you to do. And actually having a physical newspaper is much better than having an infinite doom scrolling, thing before you. So I read the newspaper, and when I was a first year student in college, the Bosnian genocide was happening, and there were horrific things going on. There were rape camps in Serbia and in Bosnia. There were mass killings, and it made me very, very angry that these things would happen. And so I basically created a major around that. And for my junior year, I studied abroad in Ireland. I studied ethnic nationalist, basically terrorist groups inside Northern Ireland, Protestant paramilitary groups. Somehow survived that. I'm not sure how, but through good luck. And then I was hitchhiking through the war zone in Bosnia. And then when I was there, and it was tricky to get inside the Bosnia-Herzegovina at the time, the Rwandan genocide happened that summer when I was there in 1994. And everyone I met said, I'll drive trucks and stuff around this war zone, but I will never go to Rwanda. So that's where I ended up. Anyway, so I came to law for a purpose, right? And I've taken some, unusual turns perhaps, but it was really driven by a mission, not by a desire to sort of be a lawyer per se. and it's still a part, I think, of what I do. Although I'd love to do more international criminal law and other types of work like that on the governance level. So did I answer your question?
Yeah, I am actually also interested in knowing more about your story, because I know you were part of the US team that helped with the prosecution in the Rwanda Genocide, including the former president of Rwanda. So how did that come to be? And if you're comfortable, of course, what was that experience like?
Yeah, it was still like, I'd say that it was the greatest job I've ever had. I mean, being CEO of Lex Machina was a real privilege. But being in Africa and working with the teams there, especially when you're like a 20, 21-year-old kid, is a very unique experience. And we actually prosecuted it was the Prime Minister of Rwanda, Jean Kambanda. It was the first time a head of state had been convicted of war crimes. So that was an important step. We prosecuted a lot of cases of crimes against women. So rape as a war crime had been, it wasn't certain whether it could be, considered a war crime, and we obtained a number of convictions there, as did the Bosnia Tribunal. But I was this, young kid, and the story is really on Legal AI, the book. Again, I'm not sure if you can get it in India, but it's certainly on Amazon, and there may be a way. But when I got there, there was no database. We had no way of scrolling through the millions of pages of documents except by a hand reel of photographs, a thing called a microfiche reader. So we had to build something from nothing. We had my mother was sending me legal pads from Canada. We had the UN tribunal had resources, but it was very slow to get the budget into the office of the prosecutor's office. So it's just very, very slow. And again, the time matters when you're engaged in a prosecution like this. So we built something which originally my team leader, a real hero named Michael Hurrigan, who was an Australian cop / prosecutor, and his co-lead, Matar Diop, who was a Senegalese judge. Initially, I was supposed to photocopy like millions of pages of documents and then put them in binders. And they quickly realized that this would be like physically impossible to do. So they stopped that, and we ended up building a database in Word. And it sounds very silly, but it worked incredibly well. And this is why it's still, in my view, the best data system I've ever encountered in some ways, because the data structure was isomorphic with what we had to prove. So we knew we had these elements of proof. The database was structured exactly along those lines. It was the same. So very, very simple. And if you got a witness interview, you could just drop it into the document. It became a very large document, right? It became unwieldy over time, but you could search it. Like it actually worked for the first couple of years quite well. And then before we knew it, we had the first working intelligence database for the whole tribunal. I think when you do things as a young student, and this is before law schools, graduate school, of course, in the US. So I didn't have a law degree yet. I was just a case manager. And I think when you go do things like this, you have this, it could be the military, it could be some kind of service. A lot of it is really ego-driven, and that's okay. And for me, it was certainly ego-driven. I'm going to go and do this. And then you meet people that had survived by living in a drainage ditch for 3 months, whose entire families had been massacred, and your ego just kind of goes away, and it just becomes about the mission and about the clients. In this case, some of the clients had survived. Some of them were the dead. Like the dead really were our clients. And, it changes you fundamentally, I think, to go through something like that. And it was still one of the greatest jobs I've ever had. And so we went through, we targeted all all of the main orchestrators of the genocide for the national team, militia, the real conspirators that had done this, people that had killed the UN troops that have been killed there. We did the convictions for that as well. But it became an information system for the entire office of the prosecutor, and it was enormously helpful to everybody. And so I ended up doing analytic work product for the prosecution teams. It was an amazing experience, and there's nothing quite like that experience on Earth. The nice thing about Lex Machina was that we can help thousands is the scale, because you create one thing and it can help thousands of people, thousands of judges, like people all over the world use it, right? Even though that's just the US system. And so the scale of technology can really magnify it. But the importance of that job was really, it was a great privilege to work there and to do to work with all those folks. Very complicated to do. I mean, it was a war-torn area, didn't have a lot of resources, and there were cultures from all over the planet. I mean, Nepalese investigators, Dutch, French, Canadian, from all over Africa, from Madagascar to Senegal, and Australia. So very complicated to merge those things. And the other thing I think I learned was about when you are mission driven, the cultures kind of synthesize around you because everyone can understand an objective. And if you really focus on that, it lessens a little bit the cultural complexities of getting things done, if that makes sense. So sorry for a long-winded answer to your question.
No, absolutely. And is it possible for you to sort of break down just how you went about building out what the data set would look like? Like, what does the ideation process look like?
So that's a great question. And I think you basic design principles, right? And for us, the people that had been, federal police investigators, they had an enormous amount of experience. So they already knew how you do an investigation. So that was already, that came from them. It didn't come from me. My job as the analyst or the database coordinator was to listen really well. And so to make sure that my data system was isomorphic with that. So what did that mean in practice? What are the elements of proof of a conviction of these things? What information do we have? How has that been refined to be something closer to evidence? And then we look at, here's the evidence we have. And of those, tens of millions of pages or whatever it was, I was able to summarize that in an 11-page legal size document, just a chart, right? A simple matrix. But that was really helpful to people. And where we needed to look for more evidence, these are where the weak spots were, these are the strong parts were. But you begin with the end in mind and say, these are the elements of proof. If it's an M&A deal, obviously the end state is going to be different. But I think the principle is the same. Like we want to be successful and we want this merger to be successful or this deal to be successful 10 years from now. We want to be able to reuse that framework for, to improve our ability to do those types of deals, take those types of cases. But it really begins with the elements of proof in that particular case. Did I answer your question?
Yes. And is this database that you're talking about that you created, or maybe just like a map of it, available, or is it a part of your book?
No, so I do talk about it in the book. Of course, the investigation itself is confidential.
No, of course, yeah.
It's locked in the UN team. The convictions are, convictions are decades from now. We had one recent conviction in Belgian courts, and I believe in Canada. But these cases they're public information essentially right now, so you can learn a lot of it. But the actual content itself is still confidential. Some people talk about things. I still observe my UN and US protocols, though.
No, of course. So from there, you went and did law, and then sort of built out a career in intellectual property rights. What was that entire shift, and how did that happen?
Yeah. And just I'll close the loop on the war crimes issue. One of the other things you learn in your career and in your life is that you don't control that much. And so when I was a second year student, 9/11 happened. So the attacks on the World Trade Center that destroyed the two towers in New York. And what happened was the US pivoted from being very pro international criminal law to not, because there were wars in Afghanistan and then Iraq, unfortunately. And the administration at that time didn't want to watch its back, if you will. So it became very political, unfortunately. And without the US, the cause of international law and international criminal law is really, I think, suffered quite a big deal, unfortunately. But so I had all these great letters of recommendation. I had done fine in law school, but the ICC was not taking any Americans. Like, really, I mean, it was very rare to get a job as an American, regardless of your credentials. So that door was sort of closed. I did look at joining the military, actually, becoming a military prosecutor. But what I understood was you start out prosecuting, marijuana possession crimes and doing wills for 10 years. And again, traditionally, you got to serve your time to get this sophisticated work. But anyway, so that door had kind of closed on me. And again, it's still something I'm very passionate about. But it was closed to some extent. Something happened in law school. So when I was in college, I got into an honors program called social studies, and you got into it, and I refused to join it because they made you take economics. And the economics course at Harvard, it's the biggest course at Harvard. There's like 500 people, which again, may not sound like a lot depending on the size of your school. But to me, it was like you're like cattle essentially in this room. And, I refused to take it. So as punishment for my arrogance, God sent me to the University of Chicago, where I became the worst law and economics nerd in that whole place. Like, I fell in love with math in law school, and it changed my life. And the reason that's so important, I couldn't have done any of the things I'm doing now, but for the University of Chicago, because at what law school can you fall in love with math? Like, it's the only, maybe the only one, to my knowledge. And so I was very focused on that. I came to Silicon Valley in 2001 when there was a crash. All of my friends who had essentially gone there had fled to safe jobs at Lehman Brothers and Wall Street, and back to Chicago, what have you. And so that, I stayed, and we did all kinds of work. It was, I didn't know what I wanted to do exactly at the firm, but I knew I wanted to be in Silicon Valley, and that what I wanted to do had to have something to do with law and technology. So I started these efforts in Chicago at the university. But I wanted to really focus on that and develop it. And I ended up there. I was about to learn, I pinged Stanford a few times to say, hey, I'm really interested in law and computer science. Are you interested too? And then no one was interested. I talked to, I think, every professor there, even professors who had PhD students that did AI and law in the 80s. No interest at all. Nobody wanted to talk to lawyers. And Stanford's a very strong engineering and computer science culture. So but nobody wanted to touch the law. Great law school too. But again, we were outcasts in some ways. And then I was about to learn how to do some elementary programming and go apply to the MIT Media Lab, because there was one other professor in the country that I was able to find. He was a logic professor at MIT. And I mentioned that to the guys, and they go, no, come in and give us a talk. So I went in and gave a talk. One thing that I met great partners, Mike Janesreth is the professor there. He's a genius guy who has wanted to do this for a long time. And his background is in logic, right? Which is a very specific corner of computer science. quite different than sort of statistical AI in that universe. But he was going to do it. Roland Vogel was one of the other people. And then one of Mike's PhD students, Nat Love, who went to Chicago as well, actually. So he was one of my referencees. And he clerked for Judge Posner, who's one of the top law and economics folks in the US. So there were four of us, and we eventually found a way to convince a law professor to sign up. We had a lot of help doing that. It was very difficult. Nobody wanted to touch it. Robot, it got explained to them as robot lawyer, which now is okay, right? But at the time, like, oh no, it's like aliens are landing on the campus and they want to do some crazy stuff. So we had there was a lovely lady named Peggy Radin who convinced some other faculty in the law school to co-sponsor the center, and we were off to the races. And I was still practicing law at the time, so we had made Stanford a client. And I was working at a great, very large law firm. But like a lot of first-year law students, I was bored out of my mind. So if you make an error on a signature page or on a public filing, someone's going to lose $1 billion, right? These were very high stakes, but all the tasks we were doing, I'm like, robots would do a better job than humans at this. So I was definitely sensing that. And I did some strange things. So one M&A deal we did, the senior associate or the partner made the mistake of letting me talk to the client. And so I essentially, I'm kidding, right? I'm very careful, but it was the first and second year. And there was an issue with the deal. So there's an issue with a change of control. So all the software licenses you get, there's always a change of control provision. Say if someone bigger buys you, they don't get the same deal. This license is cut. Right. So they had a change of control issue with something they needed to sell their product. And they had to get that consent to close the deal. So the business guy goes, what's my risk? Not knowing any better, I came up with a kind of formula. It's like, here's the risk, and here's the risk that they can sue you, and X, Y, Z. And he goes, okay, got it. He was very, very happy. So it wasn't black shoals for intellectual property, but it was something that a business person could contemplate and understand and see, I get this. And I had a growing family at the time. By the way, having a growing family and going to war zones are not necessarily super compatible, things. So that's the other thing about life that catches up with you, whether you want it or not. So we did this formula. I did some other strange things too. I did, as a summer associate, we had a big industrials client that had an HR issue. So I did a diagram that just showed, here's your issue, here are your choices, here are your options, A, B, and C. And the partner looks at this thing and she goes, who authorized you to do that? Like, what did you do this? It's like, I wrote a memo, but I also had a diagram, and the client loved it, but it seemed very strange internally to people. As a counsel, as a very senior lawyer, I also as actually still as a litigation associate, if you're doing patent litigation, the prior art, the pre-existing things that come before this patent, if you're defending it, right, which you usually are in Silicon Valley, big firms, you need to find precedent, like other inventions, so that you can show that someone else invented this before the patent holder. So I built a database. It was for a database patent lawsuit, but it was considered very strange by the partner that I built a database to do this. Like, what? How do you bill for this? It's like, well, you bill for it. I'm doing the same thing. It's just twice as efficient as writing it out by hand, or just, I'm plugging the data into a database so we can have it. And in theory, if we keep getting this client, because it was a big client, we can build our own prior art database, right? And use that for every case. There's economies of scale to doing that. And that's something I really learned in Chicago. Like, how do you create economies of scale from a process going in? But that was very odd to people that I was building a database. Even for a database patent lawsuit, it seemed very strange I was doing that. The other weird thing I did is I had team meetings. Every week, I would have my associates in and we would go through, here's what we got, here's what's going on, here are the problems, how do we get through them? And most of it I was able to bill by the hour because you could say, well, we spent 20 minutes talking about this and 5 talking about this, but not all of it. So that seems strange, right? That you would do this, regular meeting type cadence. If you're on a cricket team, you're going to have team meetings. People don't just show up on the field and then do whatever they want to do. They have meetings. We practice. Like, there's a whole protocol you get if you're playing for high stakes, right? You have team meetings. It doesn't matter whether you're playing rugby or cricket or baseball or football or American football. You need to do this stuff. So to me, it seemed very natural to do that, but it seemed odd. But it was new at the time, and now I think a lot of things I was doing, everyone's doing. And even and especially at big firms, that there's a range of approaches, but anyway. So that's the short answer. That was the milieu in which CodeX came about. Then the problem was, what's our first project? And I think if we can criticize ourselves a little bit, I started out as the executive director. I think we waited too long to find the perfect project, and we just should have picked a pretty good one of our top 5 and just gone for it, get it funded. I was able to get on his initiative, right? We had a fellowship. So we had a guy who would come in and he convinced someone to fund him as the first CodeX fellow, signed off on that. That went well. And then Roland was able to get the dean to support the ongoing fellowship for all time. So anyway, so that's sort of the initial impetus of CodeX started. It's still just beginning. I think we're still at the very early stages of what you can do for that. But one of the things I love about it the most, Shreya, is that it's so global. Like CodeX, it's almost bigger outside of Stanford than it is in Stanford. And I love that. I love the fact that, I was in Sao Paulo before the pandemic hit, and the legal innovation ecosystem there is incredible. And I'm sure it's incredible in India. I'm not as educated on it right now as you are, obviously. Australia, right? Holland, right? Although Holland's been ahead of the US for quite some time, I think. Germany, Italy, right? There are great communities all over the world. CodeX seems to be an inspiration for other people to do their own projects. And so I think that's the best thing about it, is really inspiring and creating a safe space to do some of these things.
So I'm going to take like a slight segue, because I also know that you worked initially for Facebook for a little bit of time. And I'm very interested to know how that happened. I know you were in the Silicon Valley, but like, how did that connection happen, and what was it like working there?
Yeah. So, and again, I was outside counsel to Facebook early on on litigation, and this is public information. But I'll tell you a little bit about the background for that. Not commenting on Facebook as of today, or this was a long time ago, and it was just beginning at the time. So when I had moved from corporate to actually doing intellectual property full time, because it was a little bit closer to my what I wanted to do, which is law and computer science. And partner walks into my office one day and he goes, "Hey, you have a choice. You can do another patent lawsuit." And we'd done like 20 of them at the time, defending patents, semiconductor lawsuits, things like that. Very, very similar. Great. It's a privilege to work on that. But I'd done a lot of them. I said, or you can work on this little trade secret case for this tiny social networking company. And so like in a nanosecond, I chose the tiny social networking company, the Facebook.com. And we represented most of the founders, not Eduardo Saverin, because there's, again, public information, there's a dispute between them. That came into the firm for 2 reasons. One, the corporate partner, Steve Venuto, is a great guy, and he went out and he met with entrepreneurs when they'd been fired and when they'd been pushed out and when they were down, and just he kind of mentored people a little bit, and that's to his credit. The second reason was we had essentially done very well on another case right before then, and people kind of knew about it. There were a bunch of great partners on that case, but one of the things that helped was I was wandering around downtown Palo Alto at the time, and I heard this guy bragging to his girlfriend about this case and how his big giant company wanted to settle the case. And he just kept going. And so they were going for coffee. I kind of felt like a coffee too. So I went for coffee, and I heard the whole story. And of course, I'm the plaintiff's lawyer on the other side, right? So I heard, it's like, don't talk about your cases, especially not IP in downtown Palo Alto. You can't throw a rock without hitting 3 or 4 intellectual property lawyers there. So, serendipity and trying to be a good person, but also a zealous advocate. So we had this case, and it was an incredible privilege. Even then, you could see, and there were 2 partners. Initially, I was the only associate staff to work on it, doing depo prep. I also helped file a counter case, cyber hacking case in Santa Clara State Court against the Winklevoss brothers and some other parties and their entity called ConnectU. It was a privilege to work on this case, right? And even then, you could see that Facebook was doing something really incredible. Like, they were having an impact on the planet. And again, not endorsing or saying anything about what's evolved since then, but they were doing something incredible. And I looked at myself, I'm such a loser. Like, what am I doing with my life? So during this time, I get a call from Stanford, and one of my friends there, and he said, hey, do you know anyone who would want to work on a database on intellectual property law cases? And I said, sounds boring, not interested, and it's doomed to failure. So, and the reason for that is that they were going to, the initial plan was to manually review US intellectual property law cases and then put them up on a database online. There's 2 issues with that. Stanford had done an amazing job with this for securities class actions, right? SEC filings and public company lawsuit data. But that data is public, and there are at the time, there were 250 of those a year. Intellectual property, and I'm going to add antitrust because I'm a Chicago nerd, and I couldn't go back if I didn't do antitrust too. And there's crossover cases. So patent and antitrust, you see a lot of mixed claims. There are about 120,000 cases we had to handle. Any one of those patent cases could have 9,000 different things that happen in it. Any one of those 9,000 things could be a $500,000 summary judgment, 500-page brief. So we were going to die of old age before humans could review all these documents, even if you could get the data, right, which was not so easy. So a couple of weeks, I thought about it, and I called them back. I said, I'd love to apply. And the reason is building databases is what I do. Like, it is exactly what I do. It was very difficult. I had to, I still did some consulting for my law firm on the side to make ends meet. But it was an amazing job. And that's a very long story. I'm not going to take up the entire time with it, the Lex Machina story, but we can go back to it. And it was a real privilege to work on that and to be in an environment where they let us spin it out, which is, Harvard would not have done that. They might do it now, but they wouldn't have done it at the time. Yale wouldn't have done it. It's just not within the DNA, I think, traditionally of the university's programs to spin out something like that, even if it's in the public interest to do so. It's a challenge, right? Engineering schools of engineering do it, every 50 seconds, right? If you look at the IIT ecosystem, they're spinning out companies, or companies are getting created every few seconds, right? There's a new company being created, and they're world class. Law wasn't historically like that, and we had a very gutsy dean, Larry Kramer, who was, he made it happen, right? And he made joint programs happen. He switched the law school from a semester system to a quarter system, so you could take classes in any school, right? So all of a sudden it was aligned. can you imagine, like, you're changing 100 years of like how the law school is doing? It took guts to do that, and Larry deserves a lot of credit for it. You know, and I think we had talked a little bit about before we started. One of the things we talked about are some of the things you're doing. You know, we're always in this kind of, we're creating this one document. It may be the best memo or the best brief in the world, but you're going to use it once and then it's gone, right? It's like a sand mandala. It's like you're going to blow it, you're going to dump it into the water as soon as you're done with it. And that's beautiful, but you know, if you can create something once and have it used, that's perfect or great, and it's going to be used 1 million times, that's a much more efficient way to do things. And we're seeking economies of scale. So Lex Machina, the thing that attracted, and it was originally called the IP Litigation Clearinghouse. It was an academic program. The thing that attracted me to it was the entire time I was a lawyer, I wanted to do high fixed cost, low marginal cost things, right? So you build one thing, and then it's a machine that every additional use is almost zero. So every person who looks up a document, you know, it costs essentially zero for that person. We've identified it. We know what it is. We've taken the raw iron ore and turned it into a flying car, right? So they can keep using it, right? And there's zero cost for us to do that in the software realm. So moving from a world where lawyers are entirely marginal cost based to one where you create rich objects that can generate fees. They can also generate, you know, licensing revenue, generating profit margins, right? In a way that you just can't do with the very, very labor intensive work, at least not for most of the world. That's where I wanted to go, and it still is. That's still what drives me is, you know, in California, we're meeting about 2% of the legal need. From my experience, in my opinion, it's just one person's opinion, and there's statistics out there that say that there's 98% of the legal need in California is unmet. And this is a fairly, you know, allegedly developed place. It's terrible. Like, we're failing because we're not exploiting the value of software to serve very, very large communities at scale. Google does not have to recode its algorithm every time someone does a search, right? It costs zero. And in fact, you add more data into the algorithm when you use it. There's no reason law can't create a flywheel like that, that is as successful and as useful to people. Again, not endorsing any tech companies. I love them, and I'm also realistic about them. But those economies of scale, we have to tap. It's insane for us not to. Even if that sounds new in the legal culture, like, if you want to win cases, if you want to win business, you have to do this stuff. People are going to start doing it. And it's not a threat to traditional law practice. It's an empowerment of it. And I'll explain what I mean in the Lex Machina context in a bit. Sorry for droning on lawyers talk too much, as I'm sure you know.
No, I mean, I sort of agree with you, because I think as lawyers, it's a notion that's reinforced so often that everything you create is a snowflake, that you sort of fail to see how so much of it is coming from a precedent or is coming from somebody else's work that you could just, you know, picked up and built on, like added value on top of it and compounded on somebody else's work, rather than having to reinvent the wheel every single time.
Yes, that's right. Or creating a snow factory, right? A machine that produces snow, right? That is also really important. And the thing that is incredibly significant is that when you do this, when you really engage in building a technological system that reflects the law, you have to know the law like better than anyone. It actually, to do any kind of automation, whether in information extraction or content generation, your art has to be even better than the best artists and craftspeople of the law. So, and the example I will give for this is in Lex Machina, it wasn't a machine that determined what the different events were in the case. It was me sitting in a basement for 2 years, reading every trial, reading every summary judgment, reading every appeal, and then eventually scaling that operation, right? But it starts with a very, very acutely legal, creative analytic decision. And that's what creates great legal AI, at least for the moment, right? And that could change, but to me, what you're getting rid of is the scrivening and then the document shuffling and the things that are repeatable. That is what, the best use of AI is really delegating to the machine. That's what that which is mechanical, and elevating to the artist or the craftsperson that which is really requires human analysis and judgment, and that should be made by humans. So it is actually an empowering thing to lawyers, but people are scared of it.
So I'm going to take a lot of steps back, right? Can we start at the absolute bare fundamental of what does AI even mean? Because I think a lot of that fear is coming from not understanding what it means to begin with.
Artificial intelligence, in my view, is doubly a misnomer because it's not artificial and it's not necessarily intelligence. The reason I say that is that most computer scientist definitions of AI use the word algorithm. And an algorithm is essentially something that does not require thought. It's an elucidation of the steps. It's an elucidation of the steps of something so that it can be done mechanically. So you can't define something that is like it doesn't. Something is something that is. This is thinking that does not require thought. You actually, it's not necessarily thinking per se. So I describe AI as software that does analysis. That's it. If data is the mother of AI, math is the father. That's it. It's very, very simple, and it's used as a marketing meme right now. So again, you can't really you can't put too much stock in the word AI. It's in the name of the book on legal AI, but I think you have to engage in it. Just because you don't agree with a term that's used by the world, whether it's cyber or whatever, you still have to engage with it. And I think it's important. And I think there are really significant things that are happening with this, but it's essentially it's software for automating analysis is my short answer.
Okay, and since you've written that book, can you tell us more about how that book came to be, and why did you pick AI as the core topic?
That's a great question. So it really came about. So Fastcase, not related to Lex Machina. Lex Machina was sold in 2015, and it was really working with Ed, the CEO of Fastcase, on this. I gave him a few different ideas. We wanted to do a project together, and he said, we like this. And then also Steve, as COO, was also critical for that. So it was two people I reached out to, and we just started chatting, and it came about. And the world we need a theoretical underpinning of these things, but we also need really good examples. So it's a combination of theory and essentially anecdotes that are salient. It's the case method of learning. When I was CEO of Lex Machina, the only business book I found useful was not from a fancy business school. It was not, the popular ones. It was a book called Founders at Work. And it was written by, I believe it's Jennifer Livingston. She was the co-founder of Y Combinator. So Y Combinator, again, the most successful incubators on earth. It was all she did was she interviewed like the second or third employees of these great companies, Facebook, Google, Yahoo. Actually, it's too early for Facebook, but so a lot of these companies, Intel, she just interviewed like what was it like and what happened. those anecdotes were 10 times more useful than someone else's theory. So a lot of the book on legal AI is here's what happened. It's not speculation. It's like this is actually stuff that happens. And then the theory is based on that empirical data in some ways. Like here is what we're basing this on, and here's how you apply it. So I think of it as very practical, but it's not about technology. And this is also a little bit from Chicago. They don't like teaching you, they like teaching you fundamental things and how to think and all that. They teach you the law as well. But there's this idea that what you're learning is permanent across time. It's not just, you're not learning like the local thing that's only going to be useful for 30 seconds.
More principles.
Yes. You're learning persistent objects, and that's what I'm aiming for. So here are the stories, right? So here's history, right? Here's the data, and then here's the math that we can kind of tease out of that. And by math, I mean, here's the operational learnings and all that. And again, one thing I'm really stressing is hubris on the technology side is just as dangerous as hubris on the lawyer side. You need to have humility from the lawyers about looking at new things. You need to have humility from the engineers, because most of the really engineering-driven legal AI companies that I've seen have flamed out. They have not been successful because law is, I think, unique in some ways. And it's not purely an information problem. It's also human. It's also, the free will of your client can influence things. So it's quite complex. But AI is an enabler. Like you couldn't have had a Lex Machina without that. In terms of culture, again, very important that even though you're doing something very new, it's grounded in a very big tradition. What lawyers have done, I think, for the last 2,000 years, and certainly in the common law systems, we've conflated respect for past precedent with ignoring potential to improve. And in fact, there's precedent and there's ethical duty for us to evolve and continue pushing the state of the art, right? If we want the profession to be, at its pinnacle, we have to keep driving it forward. And that means using AI, it means using engineering, it means using project management, design thinking. But we've conflated these two things in our mind. And in the early days of selling, data to lawyers, half the people I was talking to were engineers. They'd been engineers and then they went to law school, but they wanted nothing to do with data. Most of them, right? They still, it is almost like the engineering thinking had been beaten out of them in law school, which is crazy, right? You need to leverage that, whether it's biotech, whether it's, language arts, whatever it is you've got, leverage that to do what you're, most inclined and best and best rewarded to do. But that there's a cultural mistake that I think lawyers make in conflating respect for the past and respect for precedent with, stasis. They are not the same thing. And if anything, respect for the past, maintaining our traditions, requires us to move forward. And I think we're duty bound to do that.
I think that's a very well put point. And I think it is a lot of times the things that we spoke about before, which is that apprehension to change sort of flows from this insane fidelity to tradition. And the sort of, it's a circular pattern, at least to my mind.
Yes. And in fact, you can see the tradition a lot better using artificial intelligence extraction tools. You can see it, you can feel it, you're going to get better cases. Again, from a business perspective, you have to, if you like being a top law firm, you have to actually start doing some of these things. In the US, and here's two places that happen in the US. One is contract AI. So M&A, due diligence review, privacy compliance review. The big accounting firms are doing this all the time. And most of the big giants in IT support are doing this all over the world. And they're doing it, there's probably I want to say, I don't know if this is the case, but there may be 500,000 people in India who are in touch in some way with the contract AI universe. And there's certainly hundreds of startups and hundreds of companies in India that are doing English language contract and accounting review as part of that. So it's very close to us. The second area is in litigation and data. Mm-hmm. And if you are a patent litigator in the US, you're using data. You can't compete without it, in my view. To my knowledge, most or all of the elite patent litigators are using data in some ways to look at, here's what's going on, here's what you can expect. And the clients expect it now as well. And I'll give you one example of this in a second. But you really have to use this if you want to win the case, get the case from the client, because it's competitive and you've got to bid. And second, to actually do well in front of your judge. Once it's out there, you have to get access to these things because your competitors have it, and the judge has it. And one of the things we did is we required our company to give the highest, best intelligence and applications to the judges. So not directly, but the Supreme Court had access to it, and all the appellate courts had unlimited access to it. And I went out and trained federal judges to use these things. And that's something that should happen everywhere. We were in South Korea a little while ago with their Supreme Court, and someone asked me, what prevents South Korea from having a system like Lex Machina? And the answer is nothing whatsoever. Someone has to do it, and you have to do it at scale, and you have to do it well. But it can be, there is competitive as well as quality pressure to do some of these things. And you do see that, right, practically in a lot of these areas. Even very old school M&A law firms are now using contract AI because if they get success fees, like if the deal closes, they get paid. The faster they are, the more efficient they are, the more money the higher their profit margin. So people are really incented to do these things, but you have to be, I think, selective and thoughtful about how you use it. Did I answer your question, Shreya?
Yes. I want to take another point from what you just said, right, which is more about legal prediction using data. And do you see that being used very often in your jurisdiction and across the world?
Well, you're predicting the past, right? So I would call it predictive modeling. I wouldn't call it outcome prediction. And the reasons for that is it's a little bit like predicting the weather. And if you do predict it, the judge may change her mind when she finds out about your prediction, or you may get sloppy because you think, I've got this case won. Look at the statistics, right? It's true of cricket. It's true of lawsuits, right? It matters. The effort you put into it matters enormously. So I wouldn't necessarily call it outcome prediction. I would call it modeling. You can say, and in fact, when we first started at Lex Machina, again, this is all public information. It's not anything private. I went to one of the, I was a partner in a big firm in Silicon Valley, big global firm. And I was talking to, he was really one of the top arbitrators in the world. And he goes, I don't need data. Why do I need data? I said, it's not data, it's history. And if you don't learn your history, you're doomed to repeat it, right? As Santayana said. So you have to have this like history. If your judge only grants one type of summary judgment motion, and she doesn't grant 30 others, if you spend $500,000 or $100,000 or whatever it is in whatever currency, drafting the other 30 things, you've committed malpractice and you've probably wasted your client's money. It's very rare a client will want to pursue something that has a very low probability of success. It happens, but they need to know that. They need to make an intelligent business decision about it. And you have to know that. Like you're not competent. If the data is there, you must now use that. And I think that was convincing. You need to know your history in order to do that. The other thing it's enabled from a more another area is IP insurance. So going back to my M&A, the little formula we made of here's your risk, here's the risk they might sue you, blah, 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 here's the formula. That's now real, and it's financial products. So you can now buy IP litigation insurance in the US that insures you against this type of lawsuit or that type of lawsuit. And the only reason that we're able to offer those products now is because of good data, for patent, for trade secret, for other things. It never existed before. And so that has really revolutionized the transfer and the management of risk around intellectual property. And it's because, you got to spend time sitting in the basement reviewing things and have the machine scale that up. But it's improved. It's improved the system here. It's also improved. One of the other things we found at Lex was we got a project for the essentially Comptroller General of the United States. Still one of my favorite clients. Obviously outside of Rwanda and that work. But I loved working for them because they were totally nonpartisan. They were not part of a party. They were just, what's the data? And the question they had to answer back to our legislature, our Congress, was, what's the deal with patent trolls? What are these things? And the answer they came up with is like, there's all kinds of parties across the spectrum that file patent lawsuits. But what we really found is we are terrible about software patents. So we're like 95 or more percent of these patents have a major independent claim knocked out by the federal court system. When you find, if you have a factory, justice is bigger than a factory, but if you have a factory and the error rate is 95%, something is wrong. And so legislatively, through executive action of the White House, and ultimately through the Supreme Court, they said, we're changing the standards. And it's not because of us, not because of Lex Machina, it's because a lot of great people took the data and said, hey, we argued about real things. And the system got fixed. Maybe too much, right? Maybe it's too much the other way. Maybe we should have stronger software patenting. But this out of control error rate has been brought down. And if you have data about your governance, all of a sudden, your entire infrastructure for the country can improve. It's not there's less corruption, there's less cost on the system. It is a radical improvement to the entire economy and system of law. You can force your patents, but they have to be good patents, right? We're not going to have, craziness. And so you can only make that adjustment, or the system can only adjust itself that way if you have the data. And that's why I think every democracy has to have this stuff, and we should try to make it as transparent as possible, but as high quality as possible. And it starts with us as lawyers to think about these things. Back to your question on, sorry, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
And so in terms of your discrete question, I would call it predictive modeling. And yes, you can do that. People will do it. They're going to do it all over the world. It starts with having really good data and being humble about what those data mean. And the people that can review it are people like you. It's not going to be, people that don't have an experience in law. They're very fine judgments. Every AI, even though it's just software that automates analysis, every AI is like a child, right? Each of them is unique because the data that goes into them is unique. So the coding decisions, the policy decisions you make as an AI progenitor, those all make a difference. So if you have a great large law firm, you can create 10 times the value potentially, because the people working on your machines can be very, very good about how they make legal judgments that fuel the AI. If that makes sense.
There's something that I sort of read about while reading more about Lex Machina, which was Lexpression engine mines. What are they exactly, and how are they maintained?
Yeah, so again, Lexpressions was originally something that myself and one of our senior data scientists, Ramesh Nalapati, who was originally, I forget which he was from one of the IITs, not Delhi and not Mumbai, but anyway, but he came out of the really the Indian engineering system, world-class guy. He's at Amazon right now as a senior scientist there. And what we did in the basement of the Gates building was we looked at a docket, like here are the events in the case. And you can't buy, every document costs 10 cents a page to photocopy. In other words, there's a charge for this. And the US judiciary uses that to help fund clerkships and other amazing things. So it's okay, we don't mind paying it, but there's a cost to it. So you have to be very selective about which documents you get. So you take a very short textual string that's changed, that's coded in an infinite number of different ways. So every judge is different. There's 94 different districts or plus in the US. There's many, X number of judges per district. And then they have clerks. The clerks change every 2 to 3 years. So there's a rotation on it. The way that data is entered is constantly changing, and it's very heterogeneous. So you need an AI to detect what this docket string actually means. Is it an apple, an orange, an orangutan, an airplane? It could be any of those things, and the text is not going to tell you by itself. You have to do a lot of contextual analysis. So Ramesh and I sat in the basement, and we came up with, it was really a language that enabled us to prototype a way of identifying with high accuracy what happened in a case just from a very short string of text. And then we would only buy the most critical material document. Again, that's evolved since then. That was a long time ago. And there's a lot of analysis on top of it, but it's an example of, and we also proved, that using a combination of expressions and customized machine learning produced superior results to the then state-of-the-art, generic tools. So by putting the domain person, me, the lawyer, with the computer scientist together, again, you can get a superior result in terms of accuracy and in terms of legal fidelity. But again, it's evolved a lot since then. This was the real lesson is creating a hybrid of the computer scientists and the lawyers seems to be very effective. That may change with convolutional neural networks and the progress that's been made there, but I haven't seen that yet.
Just wanted to understand the current market, right? There are a lot of legal data analysis software. How does Lex Machina still remain relevant in the market?
Yeah. So again, I went back to practice. I handed off leadership to a great human named Josh Becker, who's now he's an assemblyman. He's part of the California legislature. So he's moved into government. Wonderful human and a venture capitalist as well. And so we sold the company in 2015. So I'm no longer part of it. But remember so we built the algorithm. The algorithm was designed for scale. So it identifies a summary judgment or a certain event for patent cases, but it essentially worked for any other type of case. Admiralty law cases, other types of civil cases, securities case, it doesn't matter. So the value of the algorithm scales exponentially or non-linearly the more data you attach it to. So Lexis bought it in 2015, in the fall of 2015, and they're scaling that to every type of case they have, and I think probably to state as well, so federal and state. So it's not just went from, again, IP cases and antitrust outcomes to everything, and they've scaled that entire operation. So it really has evolved a lot. And there are lots of other players out there too. They're not the only one. What Lex has done, which is incredibly smart, is they've maintained the brand and they've maintained the leadership. So the guy I hired as our chief product officer, he's still running it right internally right now and doing a great job. But there's lots of competition right now. What I would say is, though, it may sound like every legal AI company is the same or doing the same things, and they do compete, but every single one of them is unique, like a human being. They are snowflakes, right? They literally are dependent upon the specific coding decisions that are made and the specific data that they're input in. And so if you take the information corpus of a big law firm and again, complying with all our ethical and confidentiality duties, it's much more useful than an incredibly valuable asset of the law firm that I don't think any law firm in the world has really developed yet. I think we're at the very early stages of that. Partners leave, attorneys go from firm to firm, but if the firm can develop its intellectual property, it can develop economies of scale and its system and the hard assets, in addition to being able to offer intellectual property insurance, right? Things like that, which make defense and other things easier. You can also use your data and your patent rights now to borrow money. So if you have a data corpus worth $200 million, and I suspect the data corpus of most law firms is much greater than that, not just in India, but in the US and all over the world. The big firms have an enormous amount of data. There's limits on how they can be used, but you can actually take these assets and securitize them. And again, well, things like patents and software and technology, particularly, you can't ever transfer firm data. But in terms of technology and algo and AI, that asset you can use to get funding for things like that. And so there's completely new ways of financing law firms being generated from their technology stacks. They've got to own some of it, right? But essentially, you can be a little bit like a software entity on that stack. You have to comply in a way that's way stricter than any other software company does. But within this layer of the actual technology, you can develop something that is profoundly valuable to clients, and that can also be a way of raising capital.
So do you have any initial thoughts on what this project could look like for a law firm that's never really delved in building out an AI algorithm before?
That's a great topic. I could probably spend a day going through that. It would start with listening, right? And it would start. We talked a little bit about this before this conversation started formally. Begin with the end in mind. Who are the clients? What do the clients need? What are the clients' problems? Never create a technology looking for a solution, right? What does a client need? Do they have a problem complying with privacy laws? Do they have an issue complying with global trade laws? Do they have an issue? They have a lawsuit issue. Is it a bank and they're getting sued a lot? Is it an individual pro bono person who's being attacked, right? How do you help these particular people? And you have to look at the client and what she or he needs and go from there, and everything else will follow. There are certainly areas that are very conservative, like using contract AI to review English language contracts is an obvious first starting point. If you're exposed to litigation in the US, which I think most Indian companies are, using a litigation analytics is probably essential for planning and to figuring out your IP margin. How much will we need to spend for this product? Like if you're building something or offering a service, like what's the exposure and how do I budget for this, right? If you can do that and none of your law firm competitors can do budgeting for corporate finance and for product planning, they will never leave you. Like they will stay with you forever because they need to know that. And a very simple example I would give is, we had a very large client, brilliant, technology company, and the lawyers wanted to hire this really good law firm, and their accountant said, no, they're twice as expensive as these other firms. And then we showed them the data and what had happened in the outcomes and how quickly those lawsuits resolved, because everyone was terrified of this firm and they did a good job in a lot of cases, that it was actually twice as good a use of capital to hire the better law firm than to hire generic thing, which would drag on forever. So you can prove the things that lawyers know using numbers, but you can't be afraid of the data. You can't be afraid of math. You have to bring in people that can have some crossover skills or hire outside experts and teach them law, right? Be the lawyer. You don't have to be a mathematician. You don't have to be a coder. You don't have to be a marketer, but unless you want to be, or you want to knit these things together, you can just focus on practicing law, but you have to be able to translate what you're doing into quantitative and financial sphere. Otherwise, your competitors will beat you. They'll get the business, they'll be more efficient than you, and they'll maybe more efficient in court or the bargaining table.
Great. So I'm going to come back to CodeX because we haven't spoken about it at all. And I really want to know more about, what was that first project? Because you touched upon it very slightly. And, what the journey has been so far since then.
So there are so many. One of the first things we did was we did a class, Roland Vogel and I, who's still running it right now, and has done an amazing job in really navigating the complex cultures and the university administration. It takes a lot of deft work to do that, just like a law firm, but just a very large entity, right? Stanford's and this is public information, a $3 billion a year operation, right? So that's plus. So just navigating that took some depth work. There's a conference every year that's really important. There is the first class we did was called Civics, Stanford Intellectual Property Exchange, and it was designed to give small producers if you have a video clip, how can you sell that to a CNN or Turner Broadcasting or ITN? Dawn, whatever it is, to a big media outlet, and so it was an exchange to enable people to do that. And I think the world has kind of done that now. I mean, YouTube rewards people, but it does it through advertising, and it's very indirect. This would have been an automated system for saying, I've got this content. It's me on a skateboard, right, going down a mountain, right? Boom, you put it up online, and that's a much more direct kind of economic marketplace that we're talking about. And when we did that, we had to go deep into copyright law. So to design this system, it was designed as a workshop. And look, if you want to learn copyright law or any type of law, the best thing to do is to teach it, because it will force you to really engage with it. And if it's hard to teach something to a law student or an undergrad or an 8-year-old, right? My goal was I wanted my software interface I wanted my 8-year-old to understand what this thing was, and she did, right? It was like we could do things where she's like, okay, I get what's going on here, and that's hard, right? But if you really want to challenge, try teaching something to a computer, because they're very dumb. They don't have common sense, right? If you really want to understand a statute, teach it to a computer. And it forces you to do that. So pedagogically building something was, I think, profoundly important to the students in that class. And we had I think 6 students from the business school. We had 3 or 4 from computer science. It really, including people that I had brought into the company at some point later. So building something provides unique pedagogy to that. And I think that's their main goal. It's not to necessarily create lots of startups. There's thousands of startups that hopefully it helps inspire, that they're networking with, but it's a networking point, it's conference center, and it's also a fellowship in some ways in terms of the people and creating anything. And I think the most important thing it's doing, Shreya, is really inspiring other people to do it where they are. CodeX is great because people like you and folks from all over the world go there, virtually or otherwise. What I will say is you can also do all of these things, in any place. And in some ways, you can have a greater impact by creating this in New Delhi or Mumbai or wherever it is, Jaipur, because you can leverage the existing technology and knowledge base. If you can learn from it at a very fast rate, develop it there, and you'd be amazed what you can do. And it's not just creating startups. It's not just improving the output of law firms. if you take some of these really basic engineering concepts and put them into governance infrastructure, you're going to improve the lives of millions of people, right? It's very clear to me again, happy to keep talking about CodeX, but the goal is not to do projects at CodeX. It's educational, it's amazing, really thankful for it. I'd love to do more and more. The goal is to inspire people to adopt things and implement them. They could be startups, but in my view, what we really need to be doing is at the nation state level, even if all it's doing is what I'm doing in my law firm and I'm focusing on this, I've got an economic goal. But if you can do that and build software systems, even for the rich, because of economies of scale,
right,
the poor can use it, everyone can use it all over the world. So we have a program in Brazil called Citizens AI. It's a pro bono concept. And it's to build a governance interface for people that can be deployed across the country. And it's crazy for us not to be doing this, right? Like Google and the big search engines in some ways are providing this role, and we're thankful to have those utilities, right? Especially during lockdowns and being able to get things delivered, it's amazing. But you need governance, national infrastructure. It needs to be taking advantage of some of these things and bringing empirical data into the way that people interact with the courts, as well as governance in general. So long-winded way of saying the best Codex projects are the ones you're doing, not the ones we've done in the past or even the ones that come out of it.
I mean, sure, I get that. In fact, I'm not sure if you know about it. So there is, very recently I came across it in India, in IIT Delhi. There is now a Center of Excellence of Technology and Law. And I think Ronald Vogel is one of the mentors on it. And they are doing a fellowship, which sort of sits on the intersection of law and technology. And I have one of my colleagues from my earlier law firm who's now doing the fellowship. And one of the projects she's working on is a course to sort of give the fundamentals, right? Like a 0 to 1 to get you engaged in the conversation, to get you started on this intersection.
That's great. And they're doing, did you say PR law was the content?
I think they are doing everything on a very, very fundamental basis, which is to say, how does computer science, technology, and law really intersect, and what happens at that intersection, and what are the kind of things that have been done in the past, and therefore what are the kind of possibilities? Just a very 0 to 1.
I think that's great. And again, I in the book, I talk a lot about the theory of what we're doing. Here's one thing I would say that is going to make it a little bit crystallized, though. Sometimes by being more specific, you can master the theory even more. And so there's a broad need for theory. Sometimes, and I think we found this, sometimes, essentially, and I've got to go in a few minutes, my apologies, this is an amazing conversation. If you're very, very specific about what you're doing and you're focused on client ROI, your learning is going to be 10 times greater. So my guidance for these projects is actually, even if your goal is to teach theory, to be incredibly specific and help somebody. When I was in Rwanda, there was a Harvard law student that come in, was visiting. It was after the genocide, and he goes, "I just want to interview you for XYZ." And I was a kid, right? But I said to him, it's a bit obnoxious, but I said, "What are you doing? This is a country where they have literally killed all the lawyers, like as in the Shakespeare nightmare. You go to work, do something, right? Make it pro bono, because the commercial stuff will fuel itself in some ways. The big commercial clients are going to force some of these things, and they'll drive some of it, create opportunities for it. Go build something. And when you get your hands in the data, like building a software apparatus, building a model, even if it's just a pilot or a prototype, like, one, you can help someone, and two, you prevent yourself from getting lost in the labyrinth of theory and what could happen. And so, like, who's the group you're trying to help, right? And again, you can mix it so it's commercial, and then there's pro bono, right? So you can help everybody, but you gotta be, I think the more hyper specific you can be, as with the case method, the more you can avoid pitfalls of different things that can happen if you're too theoretical. If you're too theoretical, you might imagine that something might be good. If you're specific, the client will give you feedback if the system is wrong or if it's not helping them. So by making it practical and incredibly specific, you're much like the case law system, much like the common law system prevents judges from creating all kinds of regulation that conflicts with each other. If you focus on the case, you're going to develop better technology, and you'll probably learn better theory, both on the high level as well as on the specific legal domain you're addressing.
Sure. Any parting thoughts before you have to leave?
I would just stress, you had asked on email, as a law student or as a young kind of legal engineer, which is a term now, like it didn't exist before. And thankfully that exists, which is amazing.
There's now a foundation, by the way.
There is. I know the guy. Yeah, he's a cool guy. And an association, and pretty soon we'll have rings like the engineers. And again, that has its own dangers, right? We love the humanities stuff. That's super important. But the more we can learn and cross over, the better, and arbitrage that knowledge into what we're doing. You asked me what I would do as a law student now. I would do projects. Like, I would create something. And that's a radically different approach to pedagogy and learning. But the other thing I found, running a startup, as much as I've felt privileged to learn from all these places, I learned at about a 10x rate to anything I've ever experienced before educationally. So if you're creating a startup, or you're creating a pro bono project, an organization that's actually out there helping people, you're going to learn 10 times faster, and your experience is actually going to be much more marketable because you're learning all these crossover skills: how to deal with people, how to sell, how to do project management. That makes you very marketable, and often you can get a double whammy where you're focused in. If you want to do IP, you can do intellectual property. If you want to do mediation, you can do a mediation app. Right, those two things combine, and you get two benefits with one throw, if you will. The cricket.
I mean, I think that's great advice, and I don't think anybody's really spoken about it. I did have a question to say, but since you to ask you, what kind of books or courses or whatever to sort of get you started. But I think projects is a great place to start. Maybe if you could tell us, how somebody goes about nailing or finding that passion project. Is there something that's worked for you in the past?
That's a great question. What I would say is, let's continue the conversation. And again, I'm happy to help. Think about things and brainstorm. In Silicon Valley, the conventional wisdom is always start with a pain point. For Netflix, you had to pay $50 for a late fee. So he said, this is a stupid system, right? And for returning VHS cassettes, start with a pain point. Don't start and try to do something that you love, but focus on the client, right? It should belong to the client in generating client ROI. But happy to talk more about that another time.
Sure. Thank you so much for your time today. I think it was a great conversation. There's just so many more questions that I have for you for this interview and otherwise.
It's my privilege. I hope this is the beginning of the conversation, and not the end. So thank you so much.
Right. Thank you so much. And have a good day ahead.
Have a great evening. Thank you so much.
Bye.